Hello all, I hope you are all well in these extraordinary times. I'd like to welcome you to the Fintech Finance Virtual Arena where we're hosting you today. In this special episode, I'm quite excited about this, we're going to be discussing payments in Africa. I always find looking at different payment methods and different payment infrastructures in regions fascinating. And one of the few places that the payments race has yet to venture is Africa as a continent. I want to emphasize that it hasn't been to Africa yet. So joining me today, I have Chris Hamilton, CEO at BankservAfrica. How are you doing today, Chris?
I'm good. And you?
Yeah, no, very good. And you are off in Johannesburg at the moment?
That's right.
Excellent. Well, let's get sort of straight into it. I mean, first of all, BankservAfrica, we see you guys always at Cybos, always get my jelly beans from you guys. What in a nutshell, what is the mission of BankservAfrica?
Okay, so we are the payments clearinghouse for South Africa. So that means the basic payments plumbing for the country. And quite a broad brief compared to a lot of clearinghouses because it covers EFT or ACH, if you like that terminology, real-time, card, and a bunch of adjacent services, account verification, and a whole bunch of other things, 3D secure, all that sort of stuff. So quite a lot of the core infrastructure for payments in South Africa. And then we have a sort of more limited footprint into the SADC region, which is the Southern African Development Community, which is the 16 countries, including and around South Africa. And into the rest of the region, things like SWIFT services, particular bits of EFT infrastructure and stuff like that. So quite a lot of different bits and pieces and a lot of interesting development stuff going on as well.
I always find looking at different regions, I mean, the US is the almighty dollar from state to state, and each state is in many ways its own country. And then obviously in Europe, you've got the whole sort of SEPA scheme, you've got the euro, but the sort of few regions I always find quite interesting. Southeast Asia, a lot of different currencies, and of course Africa. So let's just have a little look. How would you describe the entire payments landscape in South Africa? And on the more on the retail side, what are some of the methods that are becoming more and more dominant?
So you're talking South Africa or Africa as a whole?
Let's look at South Africa, but of course there's a lot of different payments coming in and out of South Africa.
Sure. So South Africa is the most, I think it's safe to say, the most industrialized of the African nations. And depending on how you count it, the largest economy, although there's a bit of a debate there because some of the very resource-rich economies like Nigeria can look very big, but they tend to be very specific around a few products. South Africa is certainly the most diversified. And it has, it's an interesting study because it's very much a first world economy. I'm actually Australian, you can probably hear from my accent. So I'm very familiar with the sort of top end of the South African economy. It looks very like what I'm used to in Australia or Canada in terms of those mid-ranking first world developed economy setups with all of the payments infrastructure that you'd expect to see there. Quite heavy on cards, for use in retail, which is not true in most of the rest of Africa, actually, and we come back to that in a second. But also, heavy use of EFT batch type payments for a wide range of commercial purposes, how people get paid their salaries and so on, and then a rapidly growing real-time digital payments environment. So, people who come from places like Australia and Canada see all that and go, oh yeah, well, I'm very familiar with all of that. What's unusual about South Africa, though, is that it's not just that, it's actually two economies in one. So as well as that, you've got a developing economy, which is looks a lot more like some of the much less well-developed countries in Africa with relatively low levels of banked population, a lot of cash usage still, a lot of very targeted narrow services like mobile money and stuff like that, and very much in a rapidly evolving sort of state. So what's unusual about South Africa is that it has sort of both of those inside the one economy. And sort of challenge for us, obviously, is to take as much as we can of the next generation of developed economy stuff and spread it out in the economy so that more people get the benefit of that and there's more we can do. One of the things really interesting about this current pandemic and the challenges around that is it's really making people realise that cash has big limitations. And so, there's obviously it's a disaster, but interesting enough, there's an opportunity there as well, to perhaps do something to improve the economy as a result of necessity. So that's probably a little thumbnail sketch of South Africa.
Absolutely, I think that's quite an interesting point on the pandemic as a whole. I think I'm an eternal optimist, probably too much so, but I do think as a society we are going to come out of this stronger. We've had the enigmatic Rondel Nevo, who's very pro-choice and very pro in terms of payment methods, and he was highlighting that although cash obviously you have to obviously be physically there to kind of pass it from one person to another. So in a pandemic scenario, it's quite tricky, but it is for people on lockdown, particularly vulnerable groups, it then becomes an absolute, you can't just remove it out of the equation entirely. So it then becomes, okay, what are the other options there?
Right. And what's interesting, of course, is there's a lot of transitional methods, particularly in an economy like ours with that sort of top and bottom sort of effect. So you get a lot of the big banks all offer a cash send service where you can use your mobile to send some money to someone who then gets it out of the ATM, for that bank. And retailers have very similar services where you pay cash in at one end and pay cash out at the other end, and it moves across the country or across borders. So that sort of stuff is big here, but it still uses cash. It's just digitized as a part of the process, if you like. I think the best way that we think about those things is they're transitional methods. There's an opportunity there to build on the infrastructure and perhaps make it more digital. Why do people have to take the cash out? South Africa has a large social grant program, for example, and looking at extending it, because one of the side effects of the pandemic and the lockdown is that a lot of the people in the informal economy are really struggling with lack of income. And so to get those people money quickly, you end up having to rely on cash at some stage in the process. But if we could find a way to make it easy to convert South African term, but the spaza shops, these are the small local community shops that are relied on heavily in low socioeconomic demographics. If we could get them quickly converted to digital, you've got a real opportunity there to sort of expand the digital footprint of the economy. So lots of interesting things to think about as we sort of work the after effects through of this extraordinary change,
So I think there's a large opportunity, obviously, for some of the new challenger banks to enter the market. We did a feature with our friends at Kuda Bank up in Nigeria, and one of the things that they were very focused on is, and they kind of highlighted this, is that although you get a card and you can withdraw cash out, you still kind of need that ATM network. And I do think that any challenger bank needs to take on the region and the target market quite well. You've got Time Bank in South Africa, and they're the ones where you can go to an ATM and basically open an account and get the card out from a kiosk.
Yeah, it's more than an ATM. So these things are typically sited in retail stores, in the retail the supermarket stores. And if you're a South African identity card holder, you can walk away with a fully functional debit card account, just in one transaction, which is a really nice bit of kit actually. And I think there's a lot of potential for that. The Time Bank has certainly been doing a lot of onboarding of new customers. They've ramped up enormously in the last little while, and now of course they've got to turn that into volume in terms of transactional activity. But a very interesting development. But just to complete that picture, after a long period of great stability in South Africa, we've had in the last 18 months 5 new banking organisations. So that's quite a lot for an economy of our size, and they're all aimed at slightly different elements of the market. But a lot of them are following on from the great success of Capitec, which has in effect become the 5th large bank in South Africa, at least in payments transaction terms, by targeting that middle class demographic of aspirational salary and wage earners. Not the lowest part of the economy, but certainly the next tier above that. And they've had fantastic success in terms of expanding their footprint there. So a lot of movement.
was going to say Capitec. I would still call it a challenger, but it's kind of the dream of all challenger banks because it's now definitely it's punching up with the big boys now.
Exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, let's look at some of kind of the back end kind of infrastructure. What is Banks of Africa doing kind of domestically to help banks deal with the payments plumbing, so to speak?
Right. So we've got a good long history of your classic developed economy payment products, plus some Southern African idiosyncrasies, if I can put it that way. So EFT, absolutely, but in very high volume, lots of card. There's a quite heavily used product here called an early debit order, which I think is unusual in global terms, which allows both the debtor and the creditor for a standing debit arrangement of some kind. Call it a gym membership or a hire purchase contract or something like that. Something where there's going to be a regular withdrawal from the account to manage the timing of those to suit the needs of both parties. And so you can prioritize when the money comes out of the account. It's an idiosyncrasy for people with credit management challenges, I guess, is the way to think about it. So that's a sort of an extra product that pretty much nobody else except Namibia, as far as I'm aware, runs in the rest of the world, but is quite heavily used here. So we got all of that stuff. But in common with the first, all of the developed economies around the world, we're looking at that long-term transition away from batch type products and into real-time type products. And I would add to the real-time issue the issue of rich data, to be able to carry a lot more data freight, if you like, with the payment, and to allow much more real-time reconciliation and much richer integration with other infrastructure, not just payments infrastructure. So, as pensions digitize, as supply chain digitizes, there needs to be a seamless real-time connection between the payments infrastructure and the other digital infrastructure, if you like. And all around the world, people are grappling with that problem and how to build the next generation of payment infrastructure so that it does that stuff, including for contexts that you don't know exist yet, because they're going to be new digital infrastructure coming along that you'll have to interface with, right? So our answer to all that is a thing called RPP, or the Rapid Payments Program. And there are lots of examples, and Faster Payments was the sort of bellwether of this in the UK. They got going on this quite early. In fact, South Africa has a product which started at roughly the same time called RTC, or Real-Time Clearing, which doesn't have all of that integration capability and all of that cleverness that we we're just talking about, but is real-time. It is a real-time product. And so now, all around the world, we're all working on this idea, and the banks in South Africa are doing a good job of collaboratively working towards that next generation payments infrastructure. And it's important to understand here, as in other countries, that's not just a new payment line. It's actually a new piece of basic plumbing that a whole lot of new types of payment services are going to get built on. It's a piece of infrastructure, not a payment service. And it's exciting to be doing that, because really you only get a chance to do it once every 20 years or so. Then the potential for the economy needs to be worked out over time. So that's probably the biggest new thing we're doing for South Africa at the moment. But yeah, lots of fun developments going on.
So I always find, one of my favourite fintech stories, in fact, I consider it the birth of modern fintech, is M-Pesa in Kenya, because it wasn't designed to be payments. And it leapfrogged the whole card payment terminal infrastructure. Not dissimilar to what happened, obviously, with China going straight to QR codes and mobile payments and kind of leapfrogging that infrastructure there. Do you think that with all this kind of ground level work in terms of the infrastructure being put into place, do you think as domestically South Africa has the opportunity to leapfrog a lot of the present tech and look purely to the future?
I think what's going to be really interesting is to watch the continental integration on that stuff. So I think the South African path will look quite a bit like the Australian path or the Canadian path, in the sense that we need to converge on a new piece of basic plumbing, which can do a whole lot of stuff, and then see how well we can use it to add value to the economy. And you see that happening in those other middle-sized, if I can put it that way, jurisdictions, and in Europe to a significant degree as well. So that part of it's not so unusual. But what's fascinating about Africa is that you've got these different regions which have quite different approaches to basic payments plumbing, So South Africa and a couple of the North African countries are very cardsy and look more like a Canada or an Australia in terms of heavy retail card usage. Then you've got the East African sort of block, which is very focused on that mobile M-Pesa style mobile wallet sort of solution. And those are all transitioning into being fully fledged payments infrastructures as opposed to just cash send services. So they started life as a way of getting money from the village to the city or vice versa, that kind of idea. But are now in the world where you can leave your money in your digital wallet and use it to transact in multiple different venues and different countries at different stages of evolution. But incumbency is incredibly powerful with these kind of networks. So if you've got that kind of system going in a country, it's going to crowd out pretty much everything else as long as the supplier knows what they're doing. Networks effects are very, very strong in payments. So once you've got a successful system, it builds on itself. And then on the Western side, you've got a more traditional electronic payments approach coming out of batch and into real time. And so those different countries and different regions have quite different approaches to the future evolution. I spent a bit of time working with SARB and with the Southern African Development Community banks on how to build cross-border regional services. And of course, one of the challenges is the different domestic jurisdictions have quite different approaches. And so you have to say, well, okay, how do we mix these things together? So we're working on a cross-border product at the moment, which is deliberately designed to allow bank systems and telco systems to interact relatively easily. And it's still very early stages, but it's quite interesting to see how you can sort of solve some of those problems and allow for a seamless transition of money from let's say a telco wallet in Zambia to a bank account in South Africa. That's the kind of goal we're aiming for there. And I think you'll see a lot of that kind of development starting to happen in Africa in the next 5 to 10 years.
Absolutely. Well, one of the, I had my stat, but I can't recall it off the top of my head. But I read that last year it was something like, of all the cross-border payments happening on continental Africa, it's something like 60% of them are remaining on the continent, up from like 40% the previous year. I'm sure my stat's off, but it was basically a significant chunk. What does that mean for you guys, bearing in mind, of course, South Africa's position, but also, as you mentioned, you've got North Africa, you've got East Africa, you've got West, all having kind of different...
traffic in Africa is by thinking about the corridors. There are very big corridors and then there are sort of thin corridors. And a lot of the bigger corridors are into or out of South Africa, but not all of them. And so you need to really identify those corridors and then see how you can serve those well. What is interesting is that the development of some of these cross-border systems within Africa, and a good example is the regional service for high value, which has been developed in Southern Africa for the 16 countries there, sponsored by the SARB, by the central bank in South Africa here, which has opened up the opportunity for much more seamless real-time transfers between those jurisdictions. At the moment, only at a corporate level, we're not talking retail payments here. But there's an opportunity then to build on that into the retail sphere, which we're keen to do, of course. So, and what we're seeing is that a lot of payments used to go out of Africa and back in again. So they would go out to London or out to the US or out to China and back in again, because that was how the payments flows were set up. And part of that's a legacy of colonialism, I suspect, that there are linkages that go into the colonial history of connections with Europe and then back in as well. But the more that the domestic jurisdictions get their own payments digitisation happening, the more they can remove some of that inefficient bouncing back and forth and speed up the whole infrastructure. So there's probably quite a lot of economic development opportunity in getting that stuff right. And in Africa, there are now, let's say, 5, I think, regional groupings: the Southern African, West African, Central African, East and North, which are seeking in different ways to try and provide that service to the communities within their regional borders. Interesting times.
Absolutely. Well, obviously Africa, there's so much opportunity, not just on the continent, but particularly in South Africa. What are some of the newbies entering the market in South Africa? I know we've talked a little bit about Time, talked a little bit about Capitec. Who are some of the other newbies entering the market who we're quite excited about?
So there's a range of different offerings looking at different target markets, I suppose. And as I mentioned before, a lot of them are following along behind Capitec, which has had such a great success, playing into that lower middle class aspirational segment of the population. Time Bank very much focused around and offering into the retail supermarket sort of sector and people with connections there. There's an outfit called Bank Zero, which is still very much in developmental mode, but I think that's pitched specifically at the sort of tech-savvy consumer. So it's people who are very comfortable living on their mobile phones and doing things in a complete digital way. And we've seen that developing in other countries as well, and this is the first, I think, South African attempt to do that. Started up by one of the senior executives of one of the big four, formerly banks. And so that's coming along. There's been a big development in the post office trying to develop out into full-scale payment services. And they now run the grants program for the government, and that's a change from last year. So that's been a quick ramp up for them in terms of the opportunity to offer full-scale banking services. What else?
There's quite a variety of different, different needs and different niches.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, the growth potential in an economy like this is very substantial. There's still an enormous amount of cash to be replaced by someone who can get the model right in different sectors, And I really think there'd be an economic multiplier from effectively replacing that cash. There's a lot of hidden cost in cash, a lot of inefficiency, a lot of crime. And if we can get that to happen effectively, and of course, ironically, this pandemic creates a bit of a space, a bit of an opportunity, I think, for that to happen. We could really get a lot more economic liquidity flowing through the system, quick reuse of cash, and then the opportunity for people to grow their own prosperity off the back of that activity. So, but first we've got to get the country back to work from the lockdown. That's a sort of immediate challenge,
Absolutely. Well, that was the last thing I kind of wanted to come to. How are you guys at BankservAfrica? Because obviously you're quite a critical infrastructure. So how are you operating during this? Because is everything in the cloud? What's the setup at the moment?
Yeah. So luckily, although I can't honestly say that we ever did a BCP about a pandemic like this, we like a lot of the central infrastructures spend quite a lot of time worrying about business continuity and testing for it and trying to do scenarios. So I was quite happy with the way the guys sort of came to terms with it and put all the planning into action. You start to realise why you do all that BCP stuff when it actually happens to you. We decided relatively early to take the pandemic risk very seriously, and so before the country itself went into lockdown, we'd effectively sent all non-essential staff home. So sort of put the company into lockdown, if you will. I mean, it's a highly digitized operation already. And the one exception to that actually is check processing, which we still do on a legacy basis for South Africa. And checks, of course, are themselves a bit of a vector of potential infection. So that's created its own complexity. But at least that's now a residual part of the payment system, so it's less of a central issue. But apart from that, you can, on an emergency basis, run the entire South African core infrastructure on a very small number of people, and that's essentially what we've been doing, arranged in shifts and seeking to screen for symptoms of COVID and stuff like that. So that's all in place. You can see I've got this is my mask because I'm in the office today, so I need to have a mask at all times, and everyone here is walking around with a mask and hand sanitizer and the whole shooting match, So that's gone quite well, and we're probably in a posture where if we had to, we could keep doing this for a couple of months. I hope we don't have to. But right now in South Africa, we're in week 4 of a 5-week lockdown period, and it's not quite clear what's going to happen after that. But perhaps some relaxation, but some continuation, I expect. And all of that's gone really well. And what's really heartening to see is that the banks have all been very, very responsive and working very effectively with each other to organise the basic services that everybody needs without any interruption. And in fact, South Africa hasn't had any major disruption on that at all. So that's nice to see that all of that sort of industry planning comes off.
Absolutely, very good. Put it down for forward thinking. Put it down as forward thinking.
Yeah,
excellent.
Let's call it.
Well, thanks very much for taking the time to join us today. Where can we find out more about BankservAfrica? I mean, obviously we're going to be seeing you at every single event in the next month.
Yeah, absolutely, virtually and otherwise. That's right. Yes. So BankservAfrica.com is probably the easiest place to start. Pretty good coverage of all of the material there. You will certainly be seeing us at whatever venues are actually around. Unfortunately, a lot of our staples like Cybos have been cancelled this year, sadly. But I'm pretty sure there's going to be an upswing of a whole lot of virtual webinars and those sorts of things to compensate for that.
Absolutely.
And so we'll need to be getting out and about with all that kind of stuff. I'm very keen to engage into the African region, as we develop some of this cross-border stuff, and we've just got to find the right venues to engage people on that. But, in this virtual world, we're only a webinar away, hey?
Exactly. The world's much, much smaller now.
It is indeed.
Brilliant. Cool. Thanks very much, Chris.